Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pell to everyone here today. So, Dr. Susan Pell is the Deputy Executive Director of the United States Botanic Garden. She holds a BS in biology from St. Andrews University in North Carolina and a PhD in plant biology from Louisiana State University, where her dissertation focused on molecular systematics of the cashew family, which is what we're learning about today. Dr. Pell has spent her career at Botanic Gardens as a botanist, educator, and leader, and has traveled the world to collect plants for floristics and evolution research projects. She has held positions at the New York Botanic Garden and Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and moved to Washington, D.C. in 2013 for American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellowship at the National Science Foundation. In her current role, Dr. Pell oversees the USBG's programs in science, education, horticulture, and operations. While remaining an active scientist, she is dedicated to helping the garden achieve its mission of demonstrating the beauty and importance of plants to the well-being of humankind and the environment, and to diversifying the collections, offerings, and visitorship of the garden. Without further ado, Dr. Pell, I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and happy to, of course, talk about Anacardiaceae, which is always near and dear to my heart. Sometimes maybe a little bit too close to my heart, and we'll learn some of the sort of bad effects of getting too close to some members of the Anacardiaceae. But this talk is really kind of a broad overview of the family. And if you're not familiar with it, you probably are, and maybe just don't realize it. So the family is most well known for its three major crop plants, those being cashew, mango, and pistachio. These are all members of the Anacardiaceae. It's also most notorious, I would say, for its contact dermatitis causing members, especially poison ivy here in North America. And I'll talk a lot about poison ivy today and about how to identify it and some of the benefits of it and some of the ways that we can sort of make sure that we don't get rashes from it. But first, I'm going to give a kind of a broad overview of the whole family. Then we'll talk more in detail about poison Anacardiaceae, including Toxicodendron. We'll talk about some of the cultivated anacards that can be used in landscapes, and also I'll give a little sort of a little kind of intro to the Sustainable Sites Initiative and mention the Landscape for Life program as well. So Anacardiaceae is a family that includes about 800 species, about 81 genera, and it's found really all over the world. I'll show you a distribution map in a second. It can be identified from other families by a handful of characteristics that are either unique to it or that are found, or that are usually found in members of the family. So all Anacardiaceae lack stipules, and these are these sort of leaf-like structures that are associated with where the leaf is attached to the stem, so where the petiole is attached to the stem. They also have a single ovule per locule, and the position of that ovule within the locule is unique in the family as well. The rest of these characteristics are found in most members of the family, but not all. So the nectary disc, when it is present, is typically between the stamens and the ovary. And you can see that here in both this Cotinus and the Spondius picture here. In the Cotinus, that nectary is bright orange, and in the Spondius, it's that sort of golden color there. And these nectaries, of course, are functioning to attract pollinators. The perianth, or the petals and the sepals, are typically present, and they typically have radial symmetry, although again, not all flowers have perianth, and not all of them are radially symmetrical. The fruit is typically indehiscent, and it's usually a drupe, although we do find lots of other types of fruits in the family as well. And many members of the family produce 5-deoxyflavanones, which are unique to Anacardiaceae. So here's that distribution map. This is actually a map showing the distribution of both Anacardiaceae and its closest related family, the Burseraceae. So in red and in gray is the distribution of Anacardiaceae, and in gray and in blue is the distribution of Burseraceae. Basically, what you can see here is that anacards are found in north and south temperate zones, as well as throughout the tropics, really around the world. They're sort of most noticeably absent from kind of extreme northern North America and Eurasia, and also the sort of temperate and arid Australia. And also they're not found in New Zealand, which is a bummer. So I do a lot of my international travel based on where anacards grow. So family is quite diverse in leaf morphology, everything from the palmate leaves of Campylopedilum to tiny little pinnately compound leaves in a Porculacaria, or larger pinnately compound leaves in many members of the family, including Toxicodendron. And then many genera also have simple leaves as well. Flower diversity, similarly diverse, some really interesting adaptations for wind pollination. Pistachia, for example, is lacking entirely of perianth. Really just flowers are pretty much just reduced to their sexual parts, and that facilitates wind pollination. Their pollen itself is also adapted for wind pollination. Most pollination in the family, though, is by insects. Inflorescence diversity also pretty impressive in the family. The flowers tend to be very, very tiny and very kind of not super showy, but collectively they can be quite showy in large inflorescences. Fruit diversity, as I mentioned, lots of different types of fruits are found in the family. The typical fruit is a drupe, so you can see that here in this Fruitosphaera, or mango, if you're familiar with mango, of course, is a drupe as well as this pistachio. As are cashews, but we don't typically eat we don't eat most of the cashew fruit. We just eat the seed. The fruit is actually quite toxic, and we do eat the sort of hypocarp, the structure that kind of subtends the fruit. And you can see that in that illustration in that lower right. That's often called a cashew apple. We'll see pictures of that again as we go through here. One of the things that's really interesting about fruit diversity in the family is that there's quite a bit of wind dispersal in the family, and that I'll show you some of those here. Lots of different types of wind dispersed fruits here. And sorry for this formatting issue. We just switched presentation modes here right at the end. But basically, many different types of wind dispersal. Some of them are samaras. Some are sort of flattened fruit that have, trichome covered margin. And Catinus, actually, the whole infructescence is wind dispersed. So the many of the flowers actually abort. They continue growing, and they have kind of hairs that form all over the sort of stalk of the flowers, and those get larger as the fruits develop, and whole sections of this will break off and kind of blow around like a tumbleweed. So lots of interesting wind dispersal of fruits. And some of these actually also, some of the things that do have kind of a subtending, either sepals that are elongated and stiffened, or petals that are elongated and stiffened in the fruit. They'll also have a fleshy fruit as well. So it's a real wind dispersed fleshy fruit, probably also being dispersed by animals in that case. Just going to show you like one quick phylogeny here, just to say the Anacardiaceae, as I said, is really closely related to the Burseraceae. They're each other's closest relatives. And I wanted to show you sort of toxicity as mapped on this phylogeny. So I'm not expecting you to be able to read this evolutionary tree. Don't worry about what the taxa are. Just look at, you can see these red branches here. This is the number of times in this evolutionary tree for Anacardiaceae that toxicity, or the ability to cause dermatitis, has evolved. And so you can see it's really come up many different times in the history of Anacardiaceae. If you want to learn more about the phylogeny of the family, you can visit the Tree of Life project, or you can contact me and I'll talk to you about it endlessly. I love talking about phylogeny, but not really what this talk is about. You can visit the Tree of Life project. This is a project out of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, outside of London, where they've amassed over almost 10,000 angiosperm specimens, of flowering plant specimens, from over 400 families, representing over 7,500 genera and nearly 10,000 species of plants, of flowering plants, where they're putting together a very large evolutionary tree of all of these. And the Anacardiaceae are pretty well represented, as I was part of this project along with some collaborators. I also wanted to say that we, with all of this morphological diversity and also the information that we know about phylogenetics, we use it in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways that sort of touches on some of the work that you all probably do is in floristics, and that is treatments of what plants grow in certain geographic areas. And recently, well, actually quite a while ago, I completed the treatment of the flora of North America with a couple of collaborators, John Mitchell and Allison Miller. And that should be coming out any day now, as my understanding. We finished it about 10 years ago and have sort of polished it off ever since then. But I wanted to kind of give you a preview of the Anacardiaceae treatment for the flora of North America. So you can see that some of the taxa, species and subspecies and the varieties that we are recognizing within the flora of the United States and Canada. So you can see here are a few things that you probably would recognize, including Catinus obovata, which is the American smoke tree. We'll see some pictures of that in a little bit. We have a native pistachia tree. There's a few Melasma laurinas plant that's illustrated here on the right that's native to California. And then several species of rhuus, and I'll talk more about sumac a little bit later. Here's some more of those sumacs. I'll just point out one thing. Many of these have been recognized, for kind of since they were named as members of the flora of the United States and Canada. But Rhus aromatica is a plant that you're probably familiar with. It grows in the eastern half of the United States in the sort of traditional treatment of the species. But for this treatment, we actually combined Rhus trilobata and Rhus aromatica together into one species, and the older species name, which is the one that has precedence, is the Rhus aromatica. So no more Rhus trilobata, it's all Rhus aromatica with 3 different varieties recognized here. And you can see the photos on the right are Rhus aromatica. And then toxicodendron. So we did a little bit of combining of some taxa together, some species together for the treatment of toxicodendron, poison ivy members, and for the history of taxonomy within toxicodendron in the United States really was regionally based. And so a lot of times what would happen is that there would be an interesting kind of morphoform or interesting population within a certain state, and they would name a new species or a new variety based on some minor character differences between that and maybe what they would see in neighboring states. And so we ended up with a lot of different varieties, subspecies, forms, species of poison ivy, things you would sort of all call poison ivy. And we did a little bit of finagling here and kind of looked at these characteristics from the national perspective to see, did these things really stand up as distinct species? And many of them did not. So we were sort of left with 5 varieties that we're recognizing within toxicodendron radicans, or poison ivy species. And I'll talk a lot more about poison ivy here in just a minute. Sometimes when you're doing floristics, you either find yourself or become aware of, by other people pointing them out to you, really weird things in the flora. And so we had 2 very strange things that came up when we were doing the treatment for the flora of North America of Anacardiaceae. And one of those was this plant here, which is a poison ivy plant. It's toxicodendron radicans of some kind. I think it's probably radicans anyway. But you can see it has very strap-like leaves. Was only ever seen in one location in Canada, and they weren't able to recollect it. So we didn't include it in the flora because all we have of it are these photographs. And there's an herbarium specimen, but we really haven't done enough work on this to understand what this taxon is and if it's even still existing in the wild or not. So weird things floristically. Another thing that we had was that someone sent us an image of a specimen of poison ivy from the Yukon Peninsula, which is far, far north beyond where any poison ivy is known to occur. And so we didn't really believe it until we heard the backstory on this. And that is that this one poison ivy population is actually growing at a hot spring in Yukon. And basically what happened is the bird, ate some poison ivy drupes, flew north and pooped them out by this hot spring and found the one tiny little microclimate where that plant could thrive. And so there is a very disjunct population of toxicodendron radicans occurring in the Yukon Peninsula. Very strange. All right, so that's it for the overview of the family, and I'll move on to talk a little bit about poisonous Anacardiaceae. So about 33 of the 82 genera of anacards are known to cause contact dermatitis, and we encounter many of these in the United States. Those listed here, the metopium is the one that you see in the US. There are some places in southern Florida where anacardium is grown, and certainly in some of the, in Puerto Rico, you can grow any of these. Comocladia is found in Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands, as well as Central America and Mexico, but many different genera from all over the world. We have poison ivy, of course, is the main one that we deal with. And all of these poisonous anacards have in common sort of a mixture of phenolic compounds that are called catechol, which are collectively known and more popularly known as urushiol. And the urushiol are what basically gives us the rash that we get from coming in contact with poisonous Anacardiaceae. Here, just a reminder is that multiple different lineages of toxic Anacardiaceae, all of them again having that urushiol in common. And this is a sort of one of the better illustrations that I've seen to kind of explain the somewhat complicated process by which we actually develop dermatitis from these plants. So I'm not going to go into this in hugely great detail, but I will just say, basically, the first time you encounter poison ivy or any of the other toxic Anacardiaceae, the urushiol binds to your white blood cells that are called Langerhans cells. You can see those illustrated here. And those then sort of migrate to your lymph nodes where white blood cells that are called effector T cells develop receptors that then recognize any future contact that you have with toxic Anacardiaceae. So the second time you come in contact with these plants or with a related, so it might be poison ivy the first time, it might be poison oak the second time. That's okay. The receptors are still going to recognize those compounds. And that second exposure, those effector T cells are going to attach to the Langerhans cells that are bound to the urushiol, and they're going to trigger the production of many, many more T cells, including killer T cells, the cytotoxic ones that kill basically everything around them, including the urushiol that's bound to the skin cells, to the Langerhans cells, but also the cells around them. And so basically what's going to result is the nasty rash that you get. So swollen tissue, red, irritation, lots of fluid, and all of that reaction is your own immune system. So the offending compound from the plant triggers your own immune system to attack yourself, basically. And so all that red, irritated stuff, that's all just swollen, irritated, dying cells that your immune system is killing. And the fluid that's in the rash really comes from your own blood vessels and the lymphatic system. So the liquid that's in your poison ivy rash doesn't have any compound in it that can give anybody else a rash, or you can spread it further on your body. It's just your own fluids. All right, now, yeah, so here's that second exposure, an example. This is my friend and colleague, Allison Miller, who used to study Anacardiaceae, and she started getting really nasty reactions to the family. She doesn't work on Anacardiaceae anymore, sadly, but she does lots of other really great work. She's based at the Missouri Botanical, well, she's based at St. Louis University, the Danforth Plant Science Center, and has an affiliation with the Missouri Botanical Garden as well. If you have had contact with poison ivy before, you've had contact with it and you haven't gotten a rash, you may be part of the 10 to 15% of the population that has immunity to these compounds and will never get a rash. Or you may just not have built up your immune system to the point where it's responding to these. I talk to a lot of retirees who say, oh, when I was a kid, I used to mow poison ivy, I had no problem, and now I'm retired, I'm doing all this gardening, and I get all these rashes. And so our immune systems can change kind of throughout our lives as well. And so you may have enjoyed some relative immunity in your youth that you may not have in your later years. That reaction that Allison had is pretty normal reaction, swollen red skin, a little bit of oozing, that kind of thing. But some people have a severe reaction to poison ivy. And I'm going to show you a picture I'm going to show you actually two pictures that are super disgusting. And I can't really understate this warning. It's really, really gross. So don't look if you're going to be grossed out. Okay, so this is the first one. This is, the severe poison ivy reaction, I would say. Massive fluid buildup, enormous blisters. Maybe even grosser though is like the day after. The day after is this, where the blisters have popped, the fluid has left, and now you're left with this sort of like sloughed skin, and it's really gross. I'm going to get off of that now. We'll go on to talking about how to identify poison ivy so you can avoid getting that nasty, disgusting rash. And I will say too that some people, I was showing you sort of the contact dermatitis version of an extreme response. Some people will actually burn poison ivy and inhale the smoke. The urushiol are actually volatilized. You can breathe them into your lungs, and just imagine, that horrible rash that we just saw on that person's forearm. If that was, a similar reaction was happening inside of your body, where you have massive inflammation. People can actually die from that kind of exposure. You can have your eyes, swollen shut. People getting it in different parts of their, sort of softer, more sensitive parts of their body can cause, quite a bit of pain. And certainly the itching is intolerable in some places. So, all right, so how do I identify this so we can avoid all of that nastiness? Well, I'm going to tell you how to identify poison ivy. And when I say poison ivy, I'm talking about all of these different varieties of Toxicodendron radicans. So things like Rydberg's poison ivy, let's see, the other ones don't have, Eximium is one that you maybe have seen. Some of these are pretty local varieties here. But basically, I'm going to go through some leaf characteristics. I'm going to go through some fruit characteristics and some stem characteristics of how we identify this. So the leaves, the leaves are compound and they have 3 leaflets. You can see that pretty well in this photo where you can see kind of the clusters of 3 leaflets there. That is a single leaf together. There's 3 leaflets. They are also located on the stem and alternating. So you have one, and then further along the stem, you'll have another one. And you can see that with this picture as well. The leaflets are sometimes shiny, and you can see this kind of a mix within a stand of poison ivy. So we've got here a bunch of poison ivy plants. This is growing in the Del Mar Peninsula here just southeast of DC. And you can see some of those leaves are quite shiny. Sometimes, all of the leaves on a plant might be shiny. Young leaves are often reddish. You can see that in that leaf in the back there. And here's another one here. Often the young leaves have this reddish coloring, which is basically just anthocyanins that you can see as the leaf is developing. And then sometimes the petiole itself is red and remains red in the mature plant. Another way to identify poison ivy is that often the parts of the plant that have been damaged, so you can see these little black spots kind of all over the leaf here. Those black spots are where this plant has been probably chewed on by an insect, or maybe something fell on it and got a little bit of tissue damage. And those are the urushiol's that are oxidizing, basically. So you see these contact dermatizing compounds, when they get exposed to air, they often turn black. So if you take a cutting of poison ivy, you might see a kind of a clear to maybe almost like a milky, not quite milky, but a little murky exudate that's coming out of it, a little sap that's coming out of it. And as you watch that, it will turn tan, brown, and then turn black. But you can see these oxidized compounds in damaged areas of the plants otherwise. The margin of the leaf can be smooth, like we see in the top picture there, or it can be quite lobed, as we see in the bottom one. The fall foliage of poison ivy is gorgeous, super beautiful, and it is usually, it's primarily bright red, but you get yellows, oranges in there as well. And I will say that poison ivy has been cultivated in several different countries. The Brits used to love to plant poison ivy. I think it's sort of fallen out of favor given the dermatitis that it causes, but I've got a wonderful example from Australia that I just learned about a couple of weeks ago that I'll share with you in a minute. So the fruit of poison ivy is also quite distinctive. It has a sort of yellowish white outer layer of exocarp that peels off and reveals a kind of creamy white inner layer that has that inner layer is called the mesocarp, and it's typically covered in these sort of black stripes, and those again are the oxidized dermatitis causing compounds. The stems are also pretty distinctive in poison ivy. They typically are covered with these kind of aerial roots that make them look a bit hairy. They can be climbing or freestanding. They're typically climbing in Tuxedorum radicans, although Rydbergii is the sort of northern poison ivy, or Rydberg is poison ivy, and that one is freestanding. In older lianas, the woody vine of poison ivy, you'll see that those aerial roots really kind of cover the whole stem and make it look quite hairy. You might have multiple poison ivy lianas covering the whole trunk of a plant, of a tree. Here is a pond cypress that's covered in poison ivy, but sometimes you'll have a single stem that grows up it, and then what happens is that the poison ivy will actually branch out from its single stem. So up on the kind of left side of this tulip poplar trunk, you can see that there's a vine or liana climbing up there, and then all of those darker lower branches, the darker leaves that you see in that canopy, those are all poison ivy leaves, and they're emerging from the poison ivy branches that are kind of underneath the majority of the tulip poplar branches with its lighter yellow leaves. All right, so there's a lot of lookalike plants, so let's talk about some of those. So this is kind of a typical scene. This is at a garden here in my neighborhood in Northeast DC. And I came across this a few months ago, and there is poison ivy in there. It's kind of in the middle to the bottom, but the bigger plants here that kind of look like poison ivy, that's actually a legume. There's quite a few legumes that can look like poison ivy. Here it is up close there. So that is not poison ivy, that is a legume. Box elder is one of the kind of things that I hear people when I go on hikes being confused about the most. There's a really easy way to tell box elder, a sort of know from poison ivy, and that is its leaves are opposite. So they're attached directly opposite each other on the stem as opposed to being alternate like poison ivy is. So if you look closer, you'll see opposite leaves. That is totally fine. It's just a maple. And in fact, that leaf looks so convincing like poison ivy that I was at a friend's house and they had a quilt that their mother-in-law made, and they had this leaf in there. And I was like, oh man, I want this to be poison ivy so bad. And then I looked at the rest of the quilt and I thought, oh, these are all trees. It must be a box elder. Blackberry can fool people sometimes. It has 3 leaflets in some cases. Often it has 5, but sometimes it has 3. But it has spines and prickles. It has prickles all over the stem. So poison ivy never has prickles. Virginia creeper is one of the kind of, I would say, closest lookalikes when it's in a young stage. So here you can see this is a fall foliage of Virginia creeper. And I want you to look at that leaf in the middle there. It has 3 leaflets. And the young Parthenocissus, young Virginia creeper will often have just 3 leaflets. And that's where it can really look like poison ivy. But it does climb like poison ivy. It does have adventitious roots on the stem. But it has little sucker discs on its tendrils. So it has tendrils, which poison ivy doesn't have, and it has little sucker discs on those. So easy to distinguish. And most of the plant has 5 leaflets, which most poison ivy does not have. And finally, aromatic sumac, Rhus aromatica, is a lookalike. It's really commonly planted in urban areas. Does very well in cityscapes. And so people will see these 3 leaflets and think it's poison ivy, but it is a woody shrub and has very different fruits and whatnot. So easy to distinguish from poison ivy as well. So what are the benefits of poison ivy? If we're trying to avoid it because it gives us a rash, but it's got a lot of really great benefits. It provides food for wildlife. This is a really wonderful photograph that I got online of a woodpecker eating Toxicodendron radicans drupes. Pretty cool. But many different animals eat poison ivy fruits, which is really nice benefit for them. It can be important in erosion control. There's a really extensive rhizome network underneath the ground that poison ivy has, which makes it really hard to eradicate, but it makes it great for erosion control. It's also flood tolerant, and it has beautiful fall foliage as well. So, all right, so here's a quiz. So what do you see here? This is one of my employees sent me this photo and said, I think I have poison ivy in my gutters. And what do you think? Do we have poison ivy here? We definitely have poison ivy here. So it's right in kind of the middle. There's a different plant just below, and just above, there's a grapevine growing up there, but certainly there's poison ivy. And then here, this is from a camping site that I stayed at over Labor Day weekend, and there's a tree here which is mostly dead. I think it's a Gleditsia, it looks like, but all of the lower branches on this plant, not the big green one to the mid right, but all the other branches are poison ivy. That thing was completely covered in poison ivy, and not a place that you really want to put your tent underneath, especially in the fall when those leaves might fall in your tent. So what do we do to avoid this? Well, one, hopefully you know how to identify it now, so don't touch it. You can, look where you're walking, look where you're touching, look where your dog is walking, and keep away from it. But there's also some decent products that you can use to prevent actually getting the dermatitis. So one, avoid, wash your hands, wash your clothes, wash your dog after you come in any contact with poison ivy. You can also use IVX, which is a pre-contact solution that will prevent those urushiol compounds from binding to your skin cells and prevent you at all from getting a rash. And then for treatments, steroids are really going to be the best treatment if you get a nasty rash, and those can be prescribed by your doctor. You can get them over the counter. There's a lot of other sort of treatments and preventatives that are sold out there. This Grandma's Poison Ivy and Oak Bar. It's from my local hardware store. Its active ingredient you can see there is oatmeal. And then, of course, people have talked, for hundreds of years about using jewelweed as a treatment for poison ivy. And I will say what jewelweed does is it basically has some anti-inflammatory properties. What oatmeal will do is sort of dry your skin a bit. Neither of these is going to prevent you from getting a rash, or is going to significantly shorten the duration of your rash. Most people develop a rash within 2 weeks of contact of poison ivy or other toxic Anacardiaceae, and those rashes may last for just a couple of days. They may last for weeks, depending on how extensive they are. much of your body they cover, how nasty the blisters are, etc. They will last longer or shorter. I've been working on this family for over 20 years, and I get little tiny dots. They don't, they just develop right exactly where I came in contact with it, and they don't really get much worse from when they start, and they just last a few days. But I know people who will suffer for over a month with a rash. All right, so how can you get poison ivy? Well, direct contact with the plant, any part of it in any season, whether they're leaves that you're raking up in the fall or in the middle of the winter, you're trying to pull the stems out. All of those will give you a rash. Contact with a pet who has had direct contact with the plant. The urushiol's are quite oily and they will get on your dog's fur. Your dog will not get a rash, but you can get a rash from petting your dog. And contact with clothing or tools that have had contact with poison ivy, even if it was years and years ago. They will last for a very long time. So I can give you an example. I was recently in Australia at the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria at their Melbourne location in the herbarium, and was going through some specimens. This is a poison ivy specimen from 1881, and I could have definitely got poison ivy from that, even though it's so old. Those urushiol's are probably still active on that plant, on that specimen rather. This is another specimen I just wanted to share with you that I saw while I was in Australia. Again, this is in Australia at the Royal Botanic Gardens. I was in Melbourne, and this is a plant that is from Victoria, so where the Melbourne is located. And it says here on the label, I thought this was pretty funny. It says, cultivated, plant was sent in to the Melbourne herbarium for checking as a suspected cause of a serious skin complaint suffered by Mrs. Fletcher. Without doubt, this was the cause of her trouble. So Mrs. Fletcher had cultivated poison ivy, probably because it's beautiful and has great fall foliage, and was gardening, tending to it, and got a nasty rash. And I think she probably took that out of her garden after that. This was in 1962. Again, probably still can get poison ivy from that specimen. All right, how can you not get poison ivy? Well, you can't get poison ivy from contacting someone who has a rash and who has bathed since they came in contact with poison ivy. You can't get it from contacting something that person has recently touched. Let's say they're somebody who you live with. You can't get it from the couch that they sat on, etc. Again, once things are washed, they come right in from the field. They've been rolling all over poison ivy. They sit on the couch. They could transfer some to the couch, but if they took a shower first and washed their clothes first, there's no danger of being anywhere near that person. You can't get a poison ivy rash from walking near poison ivy, and you can't get it from touching any sumac species, and those being members of the genus Rhus. Now, it's confusing because there is a toxicodendron that's called poison sumac. This is why common names are problematic, one of the many reasons. So I'll just go through a couple of ways to tell Rhus apart from toxicodendron. So Rhus includes Rhus, like aromatic sumac, staghorn sumac, winged sumac. We'll talk more about the various sumacs, various Rhus species here in a minute. And then toxicodendron has poison ivy, poison oak, western poison oak, eastern poison oak, and then also poison sumac. So I've got a picture of poison sumac there on the right. You can see regular sumac or Rhus species on the left there. Ways to distinguish them: toxicodendron vernix, which is poison sumac. It has these white fruits that I described earlier. They also hang down in these sort of clusters that are more loose, versus Rhus that would look at all like that. So the things like Rhus scopulina, Rhus typhina, Rhus glabra, they have a very compound inflorescence that's going to stand up at the tips of their branches, and they are going to have red, hairy fruits as well. So you can see there's the fruit difference right there. So there's Rhus on the left with its red, hairy fruits. They're hairy, and they also have glandular hair, so they can be tacky. And actually, there's all sorts of fun ethnobotanical things you can do with Rhus fruits. And then toxicodendron, again, these sort of creamy white, and then exposing that mesocarp that has the black striations in it. All right, so let's move on to some cultivated Anacardiaceae. So again, family's most well known for cashew, mango, pistachio, but there are many other members of the family that have been cultivated globally. And I'll talk about a few of those. So one is, sorry, this little tree, there we go. One is a species of toxicodendron, especially toxicodendron brunicifluum, but also the genus Gluta, which is found in Southeast Asia, have been used for centuries in the lacquerware industry to create these beautiful pieces of art. basically these trunks are tapped, they're scored, and their exudate, their sap is collected. It's then processed and applied to woodworking in many, 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 many layers and many different designs, many different colors. Typically, lacquerware is going to be black or red in color, and they're made in several different South Asian, and Southeast Asian countries. It's a beautiful art form, but it is a nasty industry to work in, and that you are basically boiling poison ivy sap. Think of it like that. So toxicodendron sap, glutas sap, both very toxic. So ideally, someone who is working in these conditions is going to be one of the 10 to 15% of the population that has that immunity to these compounds. There are several species that are also important in the timber industry, including Goncalo alves and Corbaco colorado, which are strontium and Chinopsis species respectively. And it's really beautiful wood. In some cases, though, these do cause dermatitis as well. So I've certainly heard of woodworkers who are sanding these woods and are inhaling the sawdust to some degree and are getting some nasty inflammation in their lungs as a result, and getting some skin irritation on top of that. But they are very beautiful. I've actually worked on Goncalo alves before. It's beautiful, beautiful wood. There are a few species of Anacardiaceae that are used as living fences. This is a practice that we see more commonly in the tropics, such as is illustrated here with the Spondius purpurea that's in the neotropics. In this case, it's in Central America. This is the plant living fence is basically what you do is you sort of cut off a branch and you can just stick it right into the ground and it will root and form a tree. The advantage here is that you have a sort of a fence that is, kind of goes in pretty quickly, establishes even more over time, creates shade, and in the case of Spondius purpurea, is also providing you food. These have delicious edible fruits that you can eat fresh or make into jams, ice cream, juices, that sort of thing. Marula is from Madagascar and South Africa, and is a tree that makes this delicious edible fruit. Again, also can be eaten fresh or processed. It's distributed globally in the form of a liqueur called amarula and cream, which is a delicious, sort of like a Bailey's liqueur. You can buy it here in the United States, but it's made in South Africa. Gum mastic is from the Mediterranean basin. It's the dried sap of Pistacia lentiscus. The spice sumac is the dried and ground fruits of Rus coriaria, another Mediterranean basin plant. And another spice that's from Anacardiaceae is pink peppercorn. So if you get a mixed peppermill with black, green, red, and white peppercorns, the red ones are Chinus mole. Unfortunately, Chinus mole and also Chinus turbinifolium, which I'll talk about in a second, are both invasive where they've been introduced, and they can cause chronic dermatitis in some people. I have actually heard of people getting a rash kind of around their mouth from eating pink peppercorns, where they were eating them more exclusively, or if they had a severe kind of allergic reaction to Chinus, that small contact would even give them a rash. Here's that Chinus turbinifolium, that Brazilian pepper. This is a picture of it on the left at the Los Angeles Arboretum. It is, again, invasive where it's introduced. It is quite nasty and a huge problem in the Southeast US, primarily in Florida. Also, every island I've ever been to has this growing on, unfortunately. Not every island, but certainly many of them. Hawaii, it's a huge problem. It's just a nasty invasive plant. Birds love it, and so it gets spread a lot. Another cultivated plant that's not from the United States, but it's cultivated commonly here, and also unfortunately has become invasive, is Pistacia chinensis, Chinese pistachio. This is a very common street tree in the southeastern United States, where we're seeing it kind of escape into the wild more and more frequently. Again, another bird dispersed plant here. In this case, it's a small tree. Beautiful fall foliage. Catinus abobata, this is the American smoke tree. This is a plant that is native to the United States, native to the southern US. And there are many cultivars that have been developed of this, but there are more cultivars of Catinus cajigria, which is the European smoke tree. There are dozens and dozens of cultivars of this plant, and we see this species, which is from Europe, much more, also from Asia, much more commonly cultivated in the United States than we see the American smoke tree. Here's just a few of the cultivars that you might be familiar with. The royal purple is one of the most popular, and a more recent, a newer one in the last 15 years probably is golden spirit. Rus glabra, a really wonderful native plant, native to northeast US, southern Canada. and is called, Rus glabra is smooth sumac, so it doesn't have hairs on its stems, and its leaves are mostly hairless. Rus copulina is winged sumac. This is probably one of my favorite of the native sumacs. Really beautiful plant, and again, native to the eastern United States, and it can tolerate all sorts of different conditions. It can grow underneath black walnuts, which is fun. And then Rus typhina, or staghorn sumac. This is the one that's really, really hairy, and hairy stems, hairy fruits, and really all of these three sumacs can be used to make sort of a lemonade-like drink. When the fruits are ripe, those glands that are on the outside of the fruits are actually quite tart, very lemony in tasting, and you can actually sort of cut off that whole infructescence, put it in a pitcher of water, and you get a really wonderful lemonade. It's fun to also just have kids kind of touch it and lick their finger, because it's like, getting a kind of a shot of a very sour citrus. I think that sumacs are beautiful in every season. I think this is a winter picture here. This is at a public garden in the Bronx. It used to be right down the street from me, and really beautiful in winter. There's lots of different cultivars of sumacs that have been released as well, and this is a very popular one, the lace leaf staghorn sumac. This is actually you get in nature. There is a wild form of kind of a lace leaf of typhina, and that's been developed into this cultivar. It's a really beautiful cultivar. Tiger eyes is a very popular cultivar. It has this sort of pale foliage, and that's been out for a while. And then Rus aromatica, also, as I mentioned earlier, very widely cultivated in the U.S. And very tolerant of city conditions. Many different cultivars of that, including low grow, is probably the most popular. And then one that I don't really see many cultivars are, but really we couldn't grow it here in the Southeast, but it's a West Coast species, and that's Rus ovata, or sugar bush, really beautiful plant. Many benefits to growing Rus. They provide food for wildlife. They're great for erosion control. They really have that extensive network of rhizomes under the ground. They can kind of get away from the original planting though, so that makes them a little bit challenging, both by their seeds germinating and also through their rhizome network. They're flood and poor soil tolerant, and they have got gorgeous fall foliage, but as I said, really attractive throughout the year. You can see here's a picture of that fall foliage. This is actually taken at World Botanic Gardens. And this is the Ryman Gardens one. Yeah, this is Ryman Gardens. All right, so then I'm just going to give you a little tiny intro to Sustainable Sites Initiative. So I am, and actually I think my intro, my title has changed since I sort of provided that bio. I'm now the executive director of the United States Botanic Garden here in Washington, D.C. We're right at the foot of the United States Capitol. And one of the things that we do is we really have an extensive network of partnerships. We develop our partnerships to really advance a lot of different topics. We focus on many of our partnerships on plant conservation, but also really all of them have some kind of purpose or some kind of project that is to improve American public's understanding of the diversity of plants, the importance of plants to both people and to the environment. And through one of our partnerships, in this case, it was with the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center of the University of Texas and also the American Society of Landscape Architects, we developed the Sustainable Sites Initiative. Many of you are probably familiar with sites, but it basically is a certification and rating system for sustainable landscapes. And this is really meant to be for professional landscapes, landscape designers, etc. It's similar to LEED certification. So if you're familiar with LEED certification for buildings, which is what really basically a certification rating system that allows you to understand the sort of impacts of your building and how sustainable it is. Same thing with sites for landscapes. It really incorporates lots of different criteria. We handed it over to the Green Business Certification Institute, GBCI, and the U.S. Green Building Council to administer this now. So sites is administered now by the same people that administer LEED certification, but sites is really all about growing native plants as much as possible, reusing your materials, locally sourcing materials, conserving water, both in how much water you use, but also making sure that the water that falls on your landscape stays on your landscape. Really thinking about what are the benefits to wildlife and to people who visit your landscape. So providing food and habitat for wildlife, providing respite for people. We redesigned our Bartholdi Gardens. It was the first project that was certified under Sites V2 in DC. And there's an extensive network of rain gardens throughout this property, which does collect all of the rainwater that falls on it. Now, one thing that I don't have a slide for, but I'll just give you kind of a teaser for, is that we did a spin-off project from Sites that's really aimed at homeowners, and it's aimed at sort of home gardeners, I would say. And that's called Landscape for Life. And Landscape for Life takes the ideas, the principles from sustainable sites and scales them to kind of the individual level, where you can accomplish these same kind of sustainability goals in your own home garden. And that we developed with Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and we've recently handed it over to the to Colorado State University, and they are now administering Landscape for Life, and I'm just really excited about what's to come in that program. I'd like to acknowledge my primary collaborator and colleague in the Anacardiaceae, Mr. John Mitchell from the New York Botanical Garden. Also, the information that I provided on the cultivated plants about their zones and soil tolerance, that kind of thing, comes from the Missouri Botanical Gardens Plant Finder. It's a great resource for all anyone interested in cultivated plants. And then I just always like to give a plug out to Wayne's World at Pell State University. Some of the images that I shared today are from them, the ones that I credited for them, but really great sort of botanical knowledge website. And that's it. I'd love to take any questions that you all have. And I'll put up my contact information here too. So you can feel free to email me if you've got Anacardiaceae questions you don't want to ask today. And you can, of course, check out the website of the United States Botanic Garden and see what kind of programs that we are offering for you at home.
There is one question in the chat that just came in from Aaron, and it says, is there a specific type of soap you need to wash with to rinse off the oils?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a study that came out maybe it just was last year, that looked at, Technu versus some of the jewelweed soaps versus regular soap. And there was, I think, with Technu versus regular soap, so any bar soap or liquid soap you might have at home, the difference and sort of the effectiveness of removing the urushiol was something like 2% difference. So some people swear by Technu, it works really great for them, and they buy it and use it. I have found just regular soap, whatever soap that I have on hand is what I use. One key thing is to use cold water when you're washing, and that is because urushiol are oils, and just like when you're cleaning off a pan, if you put hot water on it, you'll see the oils thin and spread. In this case, you don't want them to thin and spread, because that will spread them on your body to come in contact with more of your skin cells. So you want to do cold water to keep them all, kind of tight, so they can bind to the soap that you're using to take them off.
Can you go over it was right at the beginning, they lack the stipules.
Okay, so right here in this picture, oh wait, am I sharing? Yeah. If you can see this, we've got this whole leaf that's kind of sticking up here that has multiple leaflets on it, and where its petiole comes down and attaches to the stem. If this plant had stipules, you would see a little kind of a small leaf-like projection that would occur right where the petiole meets the stem. Okay. Or you might see a scar from where a stipule had been and was no longer. So if you look at a magnolia stem, you'll see a little ring around the stem, and that's a scar from the stipules that were attached. But no anacards have those little stipules, so you can always look to see that. It'll just be smooth there. There won't be a little leaf-like structure.
Thank you.
Sure. We've got two questions from the chat here. Okay, so what are the best methods to remove poison ivy vines? I have spent many hours giving people advice on this, and I'll say, honestly, the best method is a toxic method, which is to use some kind of herbicide. There's a sort of a Roundup focused on poison ivy, or targeted on poison ivy, that's available. But an herbicide is kind of probably your best bet, unfortunately. And I say that because manual removal, you can remove what you see, but what's underground is really hard to chase down. And, I've heard of people being successful, certainly in manual removal. It takes multiple years, I would say probably 5 years or so. And that's going to include using some kind of suffocating method, roasting method of sort of putting a tarp down on the area that has the poison ivy, and letting it really heat up, and kind of prevent it from coming up. But what happens is it'll come up around the edges of that tarp sometimes. You also will get, if you're susceptible to it, you'll get a rash while you're trying to remove it. As I said, even if you're removing it in winter. So what I typically do is very targeted herbicide right on the leaves, directly applied, not a broad application, but directly to the plant, sometimes even painting it on. If I've got a big liana, a big vine growing up my tree, what I'll do is I'll actually drill hole, I'll cut it very carefully because you don't want it to whip back, or kind of, sometimes it'll be under pressure and there'll be some liquid that comes out. So carefully cut through it, cut a section out of it. The section that's on the bottom, the one that's rooted in the ground still, drill some holes in that, or kind of make some, kind of score it, and put your concentrated herbicide really directly applied right there on the cut stem. That's going to be the best way, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Let's see. What's the best method to remove poison ivy oil from clothing? Literally just wash it. And I don't think you even have to do multiple washings. One washing through your washing machine with whatever the soap you use is going to be just fine to remove those. No special detergent is needed. For tools, I typically will kind of wipe them down. I'm trying to think if I use anything special. I mean, when I am in the field, I'm collecting toxic members of the family. And for those, I will sort of glove up, but for my tools, so I won't have them on my hands. I'll use gloves only for that purpose. And then I actually don't use those gloves for anything else, because cleaning gloves is sort of not something that's easy to do in the field. And I think just generally not easy to do. So if I have gloves that have come in contact that are not washable, I probably will just dedicate those to poison ivy and not use them for anything else, and then just throw them away when they get not usable anymore. For tools, though, I would just sort of clean them as you normally would. If you're really using them directly to cut poison ivy, I would do an extra cleaning. I would use some soap on those, which I normally wouldn't use a soap on my tools, but I would use it if I'm just really cutting poison ivy, and I know that for sure. One of the things that I get asked a lot is, do other animals get poison ivy rash, and why do these plants have these compounds? The compounds are defensive compounds, in that they're not defensive against us, because defending something that doesn't get a rash for 2 weeks is not gonna, you're not gonna have that association to stay away from that plant necessarily. And so they're antimicrobial, and sort of the function for the plant, and that they fight off viral and fungal infections for the plant. Many insects can eat poison ivy leaves. Many animals eat the fruits, and very few animals get a rash. There's some evidence that some primates, some other, some monkeys might get a rash from coming in contact with these plants, but for the most part, it's us, just us.
You said, it keeps cropping up in the evolutionary tree. Is it just because it's very, protective against browsing, or you said it's really not the animals that are going to have that?
It's not protective against browsing. It's really a kind of a microbial protection. So it's going to protect against infection from fungi, viruses, bacteria, depending on, there's some other compounds that are associated with them. But so those kind of 3 areas. But there's no evidence that they are they have evolved to give a rash to us, and they don't cause any damage. And animals eat them. Deer will eat them. Has
there been any research on that effect, for, the antimicrobial?
Absolutely. There's a huge body of work that's been done in the sort of ethnobotanical and sort of pharmaceutical industries looking at these compounds. And many of the compounds are used for various things. They work well to make indelible marks. So they're used in marking laundry, because you can't wash the mark out first. And that's mostly Semicarpus species that are used for that, but similar family compounds that cause dermatitis that poison ivy does. Another question that's in the chat is, where did poison ivy originate from, a specific continent? It's a great question. So toxic adendron is found throughout Asia. It's found throughout North America, down into Mexico, Caribbean, Central America, Northern South America, throughout the Pacific. You know, it's really widespread. The Toxidina in the genus is. So where its center of origin is, probably Southeast Asia, but I don't know for sure. The center of origin for Anacardiaceae, or the center of diversity for Anacardiaceae, is Malaysia. And it's been around for many dozens of millions of years, probably 80 million or more years. So where exactly it came from is you know, probably one of the early continent masses, but certainly center of diversity is Southeast Asia, Malaysia.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer some of these questions. As it is just about 1, I want to make sure that everyone can get back to their days appropriately. Thank you so much, Dr. Pell, for your time in this wonderful presentation. It was very, very interesting and informative. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
if anyone has any questions about any other ELA webinars, feel free to email me. I'm putting my email in the chat right now. I'm happy to help out with anything ELA related. But for all your plant questions, I would say contact Dr. Pell. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your week and day, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much. Have a great
Bye.
day.